So our next presenter is will be giving an oral presentation, and name is Chelsea Woodhouse, second-year master student. I think she's a graduate, yeah, at the McGill School of Information Studies. And that the topic is an interdisciplinary approach to false information and today's information professional. Chelsea, you have the mic, please.
Hello. Hi everyone. Can I go ahead and share my screen? Okay. Okay. Welcome to my presentation. Hi, my name is Chelsea, and this presentation is an interdisciplinary approach to false information and the information professional today. The main topics of this presentation are fact-checking, journalism, and information studies. Okay, so today's agenda, l'ordre du jour, will begin with a brief discussion of the problem, false information, looking quickly at some definitions of false information. Next, we'll look at fact-checking as a response to this problem. And lastly, I'll discuss some current cooperative approaches to false information. So the problem is false information, but there's also a problem within LIS of defining different forms of this false information more adequately, especially as they seem to be proliferating at very high rates. So when thinking about false information in current LIS literature, there's definitely a bit of a hierarchical structure, but there's also a lot of overlap to how things are organized. For the purposes of this talk, I'm going to discuss misinformation and disinformation, and mention just a bit about fake news to get going. Misinformation is considered the most general term among the three mentioned. Taking a bit of a closer look, misinformation is false information that is unintentionally misleading. So when determining if something is misinformation or not, it's about finding out whether the content is resulting from accidents or ignorance. Looking now at disinformation, this is considered to be a more specific form of misinformation. This type of false information is also not new. It refers to not only incorrect information, but information that is intentionally misleading. So things like rumors, sarcasm, or propaganda would be considered disinformation. Lastly, fake news. This is really a buzz term, but like disinformation, it does have a long history. Fake news is known to be closely associated with the development of sensationalist journalism that was popularized in the 19th century in the US. And these are just some different types of news stories that are considered fake news: clickbait, shockers, events, and fear inducers. So all this to say, the reality is that all forms of false information really undermine the public's confidence in the reliability of news. And as a result, the information that we're at risk of consuming can be incredibly disorienting at times. So recent literature shows that LIS professionals remain committed to fighting fake news, particularly by reviving interest in different forms of information literacies. However, in journalism, professional fact-checkers are the ones who take on the task of thwarting the efforts of fake news media and correcting false information. Before moving on to some more specifics of fact-checking, I'd like to go over the disinformation and misinformation triangle quickly. Certain conditions need to exist for disinformation as well as misinformation to flourish. And it's been observed that the interaction between false information, considered the virulent pathogen on the bottom left here, as well as, as well as online media, which is the conductive environment. And at the top here, the susceptible host, the overloaded information user, really create an ideal environment for mis and disinformation sharing. So this presentation is going to focus on this top point up here, the susceptible host, and how to educate them to be more adept at dealing with false information. So who are fact checkers? The first unofficial fact checkers in the US were muckraking journalists responsible for exposés on political and economic corruption and exposing social hardships in a response to sensationalist journalism of the 19th century. One of the most well-known works from this period is Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, which is a 1906 novel portraying the exploited lives of immigrant workers in Chicago. And it actually led to a government response to to improve the working conditions in slaughterhouses. So investigative reporting discourse, this sort of investigative reporting discourse leads to an increased importance placed on accuracy and objectivity in terms of reporting by journalists. And this is all meant to serve the public's best interest. As time passes, fact-checking becomes more commonplace and editorial departments begin seeking more staff. And I just thought it was interesting, this image in the center is from Time magazine, their editorial staffers at work in 1933. It was common for recently graduated women to be recruited for this position. So not only is it gendered at this time, fact-checking, but it's also they're encouraging well-educated people to take on this role. Nowadays, fast forward, we have the development of the internet. We start seeing political, online political-based fact-checking and websites. We also have library guides pointing users to different fact-checking websites. There's also Duke Reporters Lab, which maintains a database of all the active and inactive fact-checking websites globally. And we can see from this graph here that the number of fact-checking outlets worldwide has steadily increased over the past 4 years, which is also really interesting. So moving now to specific aspects of what fact-checking is today. Fact-checking is a well-known form of quality control. It's still very associated with journalism, often political journalism. And the important thing to be aware of is that fact-checking as an objective form of reporting has become the subject of controversy. And practitioners are really working to establish basic standards of fact-checking that are accepted globally. Ultimately, both fact-checking and investigative journalism require that journalists not only report, but adjudicate between competing accounts of reality. And this is where we start to see that there can be ambiguity and different interpretations of events and biases in reporting that is fact-checked. It's also been identified that fact-check content is perceived more often than not as being politically charged and associated with the liberal media. Rather than a nonpartisan agenda, which is really, it's undermining to the efforts of fact-check journalism. In terms of workflow, there's been a bit of ethnographic research conducted on journalists and fact-checkers, and it was found that there are actually 5 fundamental parts of the fact-checking process, at least for political journalism. I just want to mention the first. The first step is really choosing a claim to fact check. And this is still done by human beings. And I just think it's an important reminder that this is not an infallible process and not every claim can be fact checked. More broadly though, as this global fact-checking movement is happening, journalists are really collaborating with one another regarding what sorts of standards need to exist for fact-checking as a practice and for fact-checking organizations that want to be recognized as reliable and trustworthy. Subsequently, we have the development of the International Fact-Checking Network in 2015, so this is all still really new. And what this organization does, it's a nonprofit, and it offers organizations the ability to apply and be peer reviewed regarding their effective implementation and commitment to the following standards. So standards of nonpartisanship and fairness, transparency of their sources, transparency of their funding and organization, transparency of their methodology, as well as having an open, honest corrections policy when new information comes to light. So for people and organizations participating in the global fact-checking movement, it's really of the utmost importance that the entire process be characterized by this transparency and accountability in their reporting. This last point I would like to highlight is that fact-checking is actually really interactive, and it's not checklist-based. It's not passive. It involves a person doing research to check the claim and then making a judgment based on all of the information that's available to them at a particular point in time. So moving now to cooperative approaches, what we know about digital misinformation and disinformation is that it can spread very quickly, and it has more access points than traditional print publications. Additionally, a lot of elements of web pages can be manufactured to mimic authoritative websites. And it's for these reasons that it's become apparent that methods of source evaluation that are checklist-based, like the crop test or the radar test, that may have been previously effective for print information, aren't really the best approach for evaluating digital information today. So in addition to this global fact-checking movement, several studies have been conducted recently to determine how internet users evaluate digital information. And these studies aren't actually within journalism. They've been conducted within LIS and other disciplines. One of the most talked about studies conducted recently is from the Stanford Education Group that compares source evaluation methods of digital content between 3 separate groups of individuals. And they were professional fact checkers, Stanford University professors, and Stanford undergraduate students. And the fact checkers actually really impressed the researchers with how they evaluated digital information. And according to the study, fact checkers practiced 3 techniques consistently during the trials that other participants either didn't do or did with varying frequency, which is taking bearings, which is charting a plan for moving forward. So when they landed on a website, they drew up a plan to figure out where they needed to go to determine whether a website was credible or not before actually starting. And they also practice lateral reading, which is opening new windows and actually leaving the website and seeing what other websites or what other sources had said about the source that they were to be evaluating. And then lastly, they practice click restraint. So not clicking on the first result of a search, but instead scanning through the results and then making their choices. So according to the authors of this study, the checklist approach really cut searchers off from the most efficient route to learning about a website's credibility, which was finding out what other websites were saying about the source. So for fact checkers, the route to credibility was actually indirect. And because of the study, there have been more recent examinations of fact-checking as a method of source evaluation. Specifically, this reading technique termed lateral reading has also been investigated by LIS researchers. Additionally, it's also been highlighted that there are clear connections between the sort of source evaluation and the ACRL framework for information literacy standards, in particular the principles of strategic searching as strategic exploration, information has value, and authority is constructed and contextual. So while all this research is preliminary, it is promising, and it is evidence that LIS professionals and scholars are definitely open to and interested in pursuing more interdisciplinary approaches to digital source evaluation, which I think really says a lot about who an information professional can be today. Being associated with fact-checking, whether it is promoting and teaching lateral reading or the history of journalism, we can help continue to rebrand LIS professional identities and adjust user services by collaborating with journalism experts. There is definitely a need for information professionals to be relevant and comfortable outside of the library today, and given our searching skills and expertise, perhaps information professionals will be well suited for careers in fact-checking. Additionally, within the library, with speed and proliferation of false information today, there's a continued need for librarians to assist users with complex inquiries, as well as create safe and tolerant spaces for conversation and debate of these issues. Lastly, it's been very recently argued as well that the reference interview needs to be reworked to include Socratic questioning strategies to better understand users' attachments to conspiracy theories and other forms of false information. So while fact-checking is one approach, it's not the end, and it's certainly a step towards a more comprehensive and engaging form of digital source evaluation that needs to be explored more. Thank you. Merci.
Oh, thank you, Chelsea, for that beautiful presentation. Do we have any question?
No question.
No question.
In the chat for now. We can
Okay.
wait.
Professor Bartlett wants to ask a question. Okay.
Sorry, I wasn't going to ask because I've spoken to Chelsea a lot about this, but nobody else is, so I'll jump in. So thank you, Chelsea. Really nice presentation. It's interesting every time you present it, they see the progression of your thinking on it, which is always lovely. So one, just a thought that jumped to me today listening to your talking, we're talking about the contrasting the checklist which, approach. I don't like minimizing those checklists, but things like the crap test and so on against the more robust fact-checking approach. And I'm wondering, do you see those as the things you're suggesting, the lateral reading and so on, as replacing the elements that are in things, the web evaluation criteria, like the crap test and others that have been around for 30 years, or complementing them and supplementing them? Like, you still do the checklist, I mean, checking the date, checking who the author is, and then you do these additional lateral reading steps to really dive into the accuracy? Or do you just do the...
Thank you. That's a really interesting question. I was thinking actually yesterday, like what really is the difference between these two approaches? I would definitely say that something like lateral reading would ideally complement existing reading strategies and checklist approaches. I think I definitely agree that with current literature that the checklist approach sort of oversimplifies the evaluation process, and with an approach like fact-checking or lateral reading, it really encourages the person seeking information to be much more engaged and active, rather than just going through a checklist and then maybe feeling confident that if the checklist is complete, then the evaluation is done. So I would like to say that it's a complement to this and making it more robust. But also, I think what LIS professionals can really do is advertise those different reading strategies like resistant readership and critical information literacy, and make those more known in associating to fact-checking as well, because I think there's a lot of similarities there too.
Okay, thanks very much.
Okay, thank you. Philip Mojan.
Yes, I have another question that might be like a bit too broad and not super relevant, but I just had a thought about, fact-checking and the complexity of, all the things that you got to do in order to verify the information and see if it's right. And then, you have to do a review of the website, and then, it's a lot to ask a person that's just trying to get information. And I think there's a crucial role for, like you already said, for information professionals and our field to play this important role in society and equip citizens with these skills. And I just wonder if you have thoughts about, like, are we collectively, failing, or and I know censorship is not a good thing, and you definitely don't want that, but do you see a possible future in which there's just so much crap out there, sorry for my language, and it's such a burden for anyone to just disentangle it, so that, like, basically we fail as a society to walk into the knowledge society, because there's just no mechanisms to prevent this, and the burden of cleaning up and assessing ourselves is just overwhelming, and each individual may have all the skills to do it, but if it takes you a day to figure out if this article is valid or not, then you read one article a day, and I don't know if you get, if you progress at this rhythm. So sorry for the question. Maybe you have thoughts.
No, thank you so much. Those are really interesting thoughts. I definitely, I can sympathize with that. The future, it can seem bleak at times, but I think one of the cool things about these fact-checking websites is that they can kind of, and Wikipedia and things like this, it's really a way for users, it's kind of like a one-stop shop in a way, like users can go and sort of check what's going on, and it is there's more quality control on these fact-checking websites. maybe less on something like Wikipedia, but on these fact-checking websites, I think that's a great place for users to start. And for LIS professionals, I think it's important for us to let users know that, that these websites, while they are practicing like this robust strategy of source evaluation, that it can be biased and it can acknowledge ambiguity. And I think that will also help in the public's perception of fact-checking as being associated specifically with particular political parties and things like this, and help improve, maybe, and hopefully help draw the public more to wanting this more reliable information and not settle for misinformation.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we take our last question from Simad.
Hi, yes, thank you very much for the interesting presentation. Just like Philip, I've also been thinking about fact-checking in general. And one thing that I constantly think about related to fact-checking is the fact that it's really hard to actually be able to help or do something helpful related to fact-checking in the medias and live television, because the information is happening in real time. So we have to do those fact-checking in real time. So this often creates a form of tribalism, notably, for example, in politics or in talk shows and other shows like that. So do you think that this is a problem that we will eventually be able to deal with? And what could we do to help as information specialists?
Thank you very much for your question. I think in regards to fact-checking, it's definitely, it does take time, and I think that's the good thing about it, but with the speed with which misinformation and disinformation proliferate, it's definitely not the only solution. Like within the misinformation triangle, there's that education portion, which I focused on in this presentation, but there's also different efforts being researched about automating online control for misinformation, and doing larger studies in that way to develop machine learning strategies to sort of help identify misinformation and disinformation. And then also not censoring social media environments, but maybe doing things like text analysis to help better understand what users' needs are and develop forums and things online that that allow for more constructive discussions. I think will contribute to stopping the spread of mis and disinformation.